Making fire is as important as it gets, but also the ability to reproducibly produce fire, portable fire, and fire whenever you want it, and it's predictable and you know what's going to happen. I think that's just as important as fire itself.
The need for fire was omnipresent. Every household needed to have fire readily available. So quite often the fire would be burning 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Many different types of fire making devices were tried, things like fire drills, where you hear about the Boy Scout rubbing two sticks together. Well, that's not far off what used to happen. You used to have a bow and you used to have a piece of dowel, and you would actually move it backwards and forwards, and the friction, the heat of that friction, would ignite some combustible material.
So here we have a tinderbox and a tinder pistol. The tinderbox is just a small tin circular box, and on the top you have a section here which would put the lit candle in. So you'd use the steel and the flint to create a spark, and then inside the tinderbox you have, this is the snuffer actually for when you want to put out the sparks and the flames, but inside you'd have some tinder, and this could be anything such as old rags or straw, anything dry really. And then that would light the tinder inside, and then you'd use that to light the candle, which you could then carry around. So this is likely to have had a handle at some point, so you could carry it around very easily, and then you could light the fires within the home. This is looks a very different item, but essentially it's doing the same job. This is a tinder pistol, and it works in very much the same way as a flintlock pistol. And this one was actually made by a gun maker called William Parker, who was a gun maker in London. So this would have been owned by somebody very wealthy, so very different to this tinder box. So once the trigger would have been pulled, it would have released this section here, and then the flint would have hit the hammer and lit the tinder in the box here, and then you would have, so very similar device, but obviously looking very different there.
One of the solutions they came up with shortly before Walker invented his friction match was something called the Promethean match. And this involved a small glass capsule which incorporated sulfuric acid. It was wrapped in tissue paper, and you were given a little pair of pliers, and the idea was that you'd use the pliers to break the glass capsule. The sulfuric acid would make contact with the air and the paper, and it would burst into flame, and therefore you would be able to light whatever you're looking to light. That was one of the solutions. Another one was called the instantaneous firebox, which involved a small bottle of sulfuric acid. You then had a splint, a sort of thin piece of wood that was impregnated with sulfur, and you would dip that into the sulfuric acid and it would ignite. So these were a number of contemporary almost ideas that were developing when Walker came up with the idea of a friction match.
The invention of the friction match certainly wasn't the first time matches were used. In fact, matches of some form had been used for centuries. The difference with the friction match was that it could be struck.
John Walker was a man who was born in Stockton in 1781 to a grocer. He was probably an intelligent boy because we think he went to the grammar school.
The banks of the river were filled with shipyards, there were foundries, there were various other businesses. It was on the main road north, of course. Very famous place. Wesley came here and preached at the Market Cross near the town hall. One of the people from Stockton had become the Mayor of London in 1770, Brass Crosby. Got a lot of learned societies, a blue coat school, lots of very important buildings. So a very, very influential town that he's born into. John had quite a good education and he initially trained to become a surgeon. He was actually apprenticed to Stockton's surgeon Watson Alcock, but quickly realised that he didn't really like the sight of blood, so that became a bit of an issue with becoming a surgeon. He then worked in chemists in York and Durham. The chemist in those days was mainly sort of to do with medicines from herbs and flowers and certain type of minerals. And then he moved back to Stockton. By this point his father had passed away, and so he moved in with his mother and two sisters who at this point had moved away from the high street. And John Walker then opened his own chemist shop on the high street in 1819.
So it's just down here, not far from Bingley Slip. 104 where I was born was just across the road on this side. Went to school West Road on here, see the West Road here, that's where I went to school. You got the black line, you got the vein arms, and here is 58 and 59. You can sort of see that was an entrance between, and John Walker was number 59 here. So this is a postcard which shows an illustration of the front of John Walker's shop, and you can see it in here in this newspaper article from the 100-year anniversary of the invention of the friction match. We have John Walker's shop here on the right hand side of the image next to Thomas Jennett.
In the day of John Walker, chemists were more than just dispensing chemists. They were very much mixing various chemicals together to produce medicines, and in John Walker's case he was interested in percussion caps for guns.
And he used to carry lots of experiments in his back of his shop, where he had pestles and mortars, and in his home. One of the researchers who did a paper for the Newcastle Antiquities said he only weighed 9 stone. So he got some idea of, possibly this is the reason why he probably wasn't up for surgery. But he was an interested man in terms of all the other things, mineralogy, the botany, the herbs.
So here we have some apothecary scales which were donated to the museum by a descendant of one of John Walker's siblings. And these would have been used in his chemist shop, and they would have been probably on the counter and being used to measure very small quantities of chemicals, various experiments, and to make up various mixtures and medicines that he would have been selling in his shop. And you can see it's still with its original box with the really small weights for measuring those really small quantities.
I imagine they'd be quite experimental, trying a bit of something with a lot of something else, not necessarily taking any care for the hazards that those compounds may have. I doubt they came with a safety data sheet telling you how much of something to use or how much of something is toxic. I wouldn't have liked to have been in an early 19th century chemist shop or lab, just because you don't know what you're breathing in or how it could affect your body.
John Walker was said to have been a very sort of kind man who wanted to help people out. So he just a very generous man who was always trying to sort of just help people. Wasn't really into sort of making money from people, and was known for wanting to help the poor as well.
Rumour has it that he was preparing one of these mixtures for the percussion caps, left the mixing stick out, and when he came back in, he tried to knock the composition off the stick on his hearth, and it burst into flames. One of Walker's qualities was he was aware that something special had happened. He had understood that although he wasn't looking to generate fire, the action that he'd taken had resulted in instant fire, which was something that would have been welcomed by most people in those days.
The genius was that John Walker realised that if he could get a stick to ignite, a piece of wood to ignite, on your fingertips, people might want to buy it.
It's a very interesting time, especially for industry in Stockton and travel, just the year before the Stockton and Darlington Railway had opened. And we know from the one-day book that exists that belonged to John Walker that some of his customers were some of the men involved in the railway.
The idea was to try and bring coal from the Durham coalfield and take it out, and there was a discussion about how we would actually transport the coal from Durham here to the river. And there was a suggestion of a canal at one stage. That was mooted by a lot of people. There were plans drawn up and surveyors got involved and looked at where the route might go. There was also a suggestion of a railway line, but without an engine, sort of horse-drawn to start with wagons being pulled by rope.
All these people bought the matches, and over time word spread locally.
And people came from far and wide. We're talking about Mr. Hustler sent his staff from Acklam Hall in Middlesbrough, right as far as Ingleby Manor. They're all in the daybook that's now in the Science Museum collection. So all the great and the good sent their servants to buy these matches from Mr. Walker at his shop in the High Street in Stockton.
He lived next door to a printer called Thomas Jennett, who we rented the shop from. He sold them, literally sold them in matches in tins. Far too expensive, so then he called them paper boxes, but we know them as cardboard. But these are made by the shop next door at Thomas Jennett, the printer, 58 the High Street. John was in 59.
Walker's composition was very basic, and the idea was that once the composition had solidified, on the end of a splint, you would draw that through a folded piece of glass paper or sandpaper and it would ignite.
These compounds would have been in John Walker's matches. Between antimony trisulfide, potassium chlorate, when the match is lit, when it's struck against his hearth, they immediately intertangle, react and then produce the fire.
Based on what was written in his chemist's daybook, the first recorded sale was the April the 7th, 1827. So we say the invention was sometime in 1826, but the first recorded sale was to a local solicitor called John Hickson.
At this time, other people such as Samuel Jones and William Holden, who were also involved in the early development of the match, were actually patenting their particular ideas. There's speculation as to why John Walker didn't patent it. Some say that he felt that it was such a wonderful discovery that it wouldn't be fair to patent it. And there's another school of thought that it actually wasn't sufficiently distinct to be able to be patented. The truth of the matter may never be known.
Last few years I've been looking, why did it get out nationally? And in 1829, Michael Faraday, who was the eminent scientist of the era, actually came to the northeast. He was a consultant for the Loftus Alum Works, and he stayed with Sir Robert Dundas in Upleathen Hall. Around about this time, we have the record that Sir Robert Dundas and his land agent, who was responsible for the mine, he actually bought some friction matches when Faraday was there. And I surmise Sir Robert Dundas and Major Todd would have showed him these matches, because we know that these matches were described in the Quarterly Journal of the Royal Society.
I think at the time he wasn't as well known as he is now, because I think it was said he was a very modest man, and because he didn't paint and he didn't sort of see the benefit of it. Just a couple of years later, people started bringing out very similar matches, almost copies of John Walker's matches, and of course they saw the benefit straight away and patented theirs, so they became more well known in that respect. Joseph Parrott was a hairdresser in Stockton, but his real passion was learning about all sorts of different subjects that interested him, and he gave lectures in various places in Stockton, and we do have some of his lecture notes in the collection here at Preston Park Museum, and some of the old advertisements for the lectures. And within his notes you see him referring to John Walker and his friction lights, as they were called, a huge amount. He was obviously a great supporter of John Walker, and although this was many years after the death of John Walker, he was still championing him and letting everybody know that he was the true inventor. And then in later years we also see the Heavisides family. Now the Heavisides family were printers and photographers who generations of the families took on the printing business, and here we have one of their booklets, the true history of the invention of the Lucifer match. Now they were never called Lucifer matches. This is actually a name that was commonly given to matches. John Walker never referred to his matches as Lucifer matches, but actually friction lights.
By about the 1850s there had been many different names for matches. Lucifer's was one of them, and this did continue through to the First World War, but there are other things such as Vesuvians, Congreves, Flamers. It wasn't just in Great Britain that development was taking place. It was also happening in France, where Charles Sauria in 1831 actually introduced phosphorus into the composition. The Germans were very much into large-scale production, as were the Austrians. One in front is a standard strike anywhere match. The next one's a braided light, and the other one is a double-headed match. In this country, the first what you describe as a match factory was started in 1832 by Richard Bell, but it wasn't on a grand scale, and the early match manufacturers were basically chemists like Walker were, and people operating out of small workshops. And what you find is that early manufacturers of matches didn't do the end-to-end process. They did part of it. So you'd have perhaps a sawmill would produce the splints. Outworkers would pick up the materials from the factory to make the boxes. So they would get the thin sheets of veneer, they would get their glue, and they'd get their printed labels. And the ladies and their children would sit round the kitchen table and they would make boxes on a piecemeal basis. These would then be delivered back to the match factory, and in the match factory the process, once the splints had been delivered, would involve normally a male worker to mix the match head composition, and then the splints would be dipped into this composition. And then they would be packed by hand by children and by ladies, mainly because their fingers were more nimble than the male counterparts. The real change occurred in 1861 when Bryant and May opened their factory at Fairfield in Bow.
It was previously a rope, crinoline and candle factory, but for whatever reason they decided it was the perfect match for their new match factory, no pun intended, and they decided to actually start to manufacture the matches so that they could actually be part of the process. And they were perfectly placed because it's right next to the River Lee, so they could bring the wood up the river directly to the factory, and then it could start the process.
Bryant and May formed as a partnership in London at 133 Tooley Street in 1844 as general merchants. With the Great Exhibition in 1851, a Swedish inventor called Lundström, who had founded the Jönköping match factory in 1847, was looking for a UK market for his product. And Bryant and May bought the UK rights from Lundström and paid £100.
Health and safety in the 1800s was terrible anyway, and I think, I mean, it wasn't just the chemicals that they worked with. They worked long hours, which is dangerous. They worked with machines. There was no protection. You could get your finger caught in a match machine, etc. But I think it was the phosphorus that they made the matches with that was by far and large the biggest. I mean, Graham knows he's done quite a lot of research into the phosphorus side of things.
The dangers of using white phosphorus were known in Austria around early 1840s, and but because it was so good at making matches, that it continued to be used. And in fact, the first country to actually ban the use of the phosphorus was Finland in 1872. And it took until 1908 for the UK to actually pass a law saying you may not use white phosphorus anymore.
White phosphorus was introduced into the match process in the early 1830s, and by 1839 the first cases of fozzie-jaw were being noticed. As time progressed, they understood that many of the issues were caused with the workers being in direct contact with white phosphorus. Not the actual touching of the substance, but the fumes that the white phosphorus actually gave off. Now, this in itself isn't normally a problem. However, hygiene, particularly dental hygiene at this time, was very poor. And if, as a match worker, you had problems with your teeth, it greatly increased the chances of the vapour coming off the drying matches to enter your teeth. In certain extreme cases, the whole jaw would be lost, and indeed, the poor individual could die.
They actually employed a dentist, and if there was the first sign of your teeth falling out because of fozzie-jaw, they would extract your teeth. And if you started to show signs of really being ill, they'd just sack you. I mean, it was brutal the way they treated people. And there were also stories of somebody going into a room, a darkened room, with people that had been working with phosphorus, and the people were actually luminous.
Yeah, that was actually reported by the Salvation Army because they set up what they hoped would be a safer factory environment. But to justify doing all that, they went around interviewing, talking to the match workers in their own homes, and just to demonstrate the problems with phosphorus, and these young women would glow in the dark.
Matches other than white phosphorus matches were being made, such as the safety match. These were based on a different type of phosphorus called red phosphorus, which had been discovered in 1845. This did not give off the same type of fumes as white phosphorus. However, there were certain limitations around its use because it had been patented, and this left a lot of the match industry unable to use red phosphorus.
Phosphorus, the element, exists in multiple different allotropes, and what an allotrope means is it's different arrangement in the solid state. So in white phosphorus it exists as 4 phosphorus atoms together in like a tetrahedral structure, and then when you heat it at 300 degrees or so you get red phosphorus. Red phosphorus is more stable. It's also amorphous, which means it has no long-range order like in a crystal, like in the white phosphorus. So white phosphorus is really crystalline, it's really reactive, whereas the red phosphorus is much more stable and safer to use.
One of the things that the Salvation Army did was to actually prove that it was possible to make matches safely, was they opened their own factory not very far from Bryant and May, where they actually produced the matches using red phosphorus, which didn't have the same dangerous implications. And I think eventually Bryant and May did actually buy up that factory as well and took it into part of their empire. But I think it was really Salvation Army were trying to make a point. You can make money, you can make safe matches, not at the expense of your workforce.
Safety matches that we use today, in the tip of the match it's just potassium chlorate, as it was in John Walker's day, and dipped in sulphur and other waxes and things like that. But the crucial part that makes them safe is that the phosphorus element, the red phosphorus, is on the matchbox itself, on the outside. What happens chemically between that reaction with the head and the phosphorus strip, which has also got glass in to make friction. The act of striking it, the chemicals, potassium chlorate, which is a strong oxidizer, which means it wants to react with something. That reacts with the red phosphorus, creates a highly shock sensitive and friction sensitive material, which then ignites the tip of the match. And then the fire propagates down the matchstick, and then you've got fire. But it's much safer to have those compounds separated, for sure.
There'd been unrest for quite a long time. I mean, they'd been out on strike. The match girls in particular had been out on strike. I think strikes were quite common in those days. But of course, they had no power. They just walked out on strike because they were fed up with their conditions. They worked 6 days a week. They worked up to 12, 14 hours a day. They were very young. They were being exploited, really. They were physically abused by the foreman on the shop floor. There were all sorts of reasons why it was a terrible environment to work, I think, in any factory.
The 1888 match strike was one of the first industrial disputes in this country, and it happened for a number of reasons. First of all, there was a certain discontent about some of the working practices that Bryant and May imposed on their workers, and there was also a levy that Bryant and May put on their workers in relation to a statue they'd commissioned for William Gladstone, which didn't go down too well. It
all kind of came to a head at a Fabian meeting. So the Fabians were a group of social reformers with people like, George Bernard Shaw was a Fabian, Annie Besant, there was Clementina Black. There were lots of big names of the time that belonged to the Fabian Society. And on the 15th of June in 1888, they had a fateful meeting. Clementina Black did a little speech about the state of female labour in particular in local factories. And I think it was Henry Hyde Champion who, on the back of this, actually suggested that they boycott buying Bryant and May Matchboxes because they made dividends for their shareholders of over 20% while paying starvation wages to their workers. I mean, the reason that they were paid so little as well was not just because they were paid quite low wages in the first place, but also if they did anything like drop matches or go to the toilet without permission or come to work with dirty feet, many of them couldn't even afford shoes, they would be fined. Annie Besant and her mate Herbert Burrows, on the back of that meeting, went to the factory and made it their business to interview some of the workers outside of the factory gates. And she produced this magazine called The Link on the 23rd of June, where she produced an article called White Slavery in London, and it basically exposed everything that happened at the factory. And of course, word of this got to the factory directors and they were furious and they threatened Annie with libel action, but nothing came of that because obviously it was true. So what they actually decided to do on their side was to take action and ask the workers to sign a declaration that said everything that Annie Besant had said in her article was untrue, and they refused to do that.
The Match Girls wrote a letter. It's known as affectionately as the Dear Lady letter, because it starts off Dear Lady, and they go into some length about how they've been treated, and they've decided to come out on strike. And they said, in the letter they say, we wouldn't tell a lie about what you had said. What you said was true in your article. So they wrote to her, and that was the first indication she had that there was trouble ahead.
There's a misconception over the years that Annie Besant was the leader of the Match Girls strike, and that's not really true. I mean, she did very much help them and did support them, but it wasn't. She didn't say to them, "I think you should go out and strike." They basically took that decision themselves. They wanted somewhere safe to eat their lunch, so they weren't sitting and ingesting the phosphorus with their sandwiches. They wanted to stop the unfair fines, and they wanted to form a union so that they had somewhere to have their grievances heard. So they were fairly simple demands, really. Only 12 days after they'd gone out on strike, they sat round in that room and discussed the demands, and every single one of the demands was agreed to. It was the beginning of the new labour movement. People think the docker strike. It wasn't, because the docker strike was a year later. That was 1889, and all those dockers were the fathers and brothers and uncles and sons of the Match Girls.
The labelling for matches in the early years was very straightforward. Nearly always just words, even instructions on how to use. Over time this developed. You started to get pictures appearing on there, to the point where in the 1860s, 1870s, famous people, famous events appeared on matchboxes, and advertising started around this time as well. They'd also become more of a sort of consumer item rather than something that just the middle class could use.
I personally started, as a lot of people have, just picking the odd ones up, because I collect book matches. You'd find them in tea shops, in ashtrays, and as I got older, pubs and restaurants and stuff like that. And it wasn't until I really got involved when I saw an advert in a newspaper, which was saying about this 2-day event in Croydon. And that's when, from that date, I've really got involved with it. And, now I'm president of the society, and I do the postal auction, and I hold the sales of literature and stuff like that.
I suppose as people's quality of life improved, and life was more than just survival, people had time and possibly money to start undertaking other activities. And it was probably in the 1880s, 1890s that collecting of many things became something that children and adults actually did. Stamps were invented in 1840. Coins have been around for many, many years. And as far as matchboxes are concerned, the designs were starting to get interesting. They were reflecting current events, people that were in the news. And because they were now a disposable item, you could find them on the streets.
Different people do it different ways, you know, that's the thing. But these ones are what they're classified as feature matches. They were actually issued under a patent. Obviously they've got the advertising on the front, advertising on the inside, but they've also got advertising on the matches. Yes, a lot of people think we're mad. You know, why do you collect bits of cardboard? You know, or paper that's printed on? And they're quite small, some of these labels, you know, that the guys collect. But yeah, I mean, but we all know, because we're all members of the society, we are a body of 300 or 400 people that are members of the British Society. And we all know what we do to a degree. So really nothing is eccentric at all, you know, because that's what we do. And a lot of people will collect as a memory of not only what they collect, but what's the actual social history of it is.
The match companies started to become aware of this as a sort of marketing tool. And before the First World War, a Swedish company encouraged individuals to collect Matchbox labels of a particular brand that showed nursery rhymes. And in return for collecting, let's say 100 labels, you could post this off and you would receive an album containing a complete set of 60 labels of packet label size. And this must have done something to kick off some of the collecting interest.
Though they had the same items inside, this one is what they called the wild animals set. And that, yet again, they'd all be in that set.
For the 1920s and 30s, there were a few informal groups of collectors, but nothing very well organised. There was the occasional article and exchange in Mart from so-called experts of their time. And indeed, there are a number of short pieces on Pathé News, showing collectors of their day, showing off their collections. Indeed, one of them shows a gentleman called Pater Beckett, who used to be in the army, retired, and decorated his pub with lots of Matchbox labels.
One of the strangest hobbies is that of Major Pater Beckett, who has the largest collection of matchboxes in the world, 25,000 of them. He checks every new cover to make sure that he hasn't already got it in his vast collection, which represents nearly 50 years of searching in all parts of the world.
An interesting story about Pat was that he was arrested in Piccadilly Circus as he jumped in front of a tram.
The individual covers are just about as interesting as they are varied.
The police officer who arrested him thought that he was attempting to commit suicide, but when Pat explained that he was simply retrieving a box of matches that he thought interesting, the officer understood and released him.
Famous generals, from Napoleon to Lord Roberts, were immortalised. And here's a gallery which includes the youthful Dukes of York and Gloucester. To build up such a fine collection of Matchbox covers can have been no easy task, but Major Pater Beckett has achieved it.
I've only got about 20,000 book matches of varying designs and styles and manufacturers. I think it varies differently for everybody. It was in my mind, I can't concentrate on everything because I haven't got the money, I haven't got the room, and I can't, you know, I'm picking up stuff here, there and everywhere. So then I decided I would, if you like, diversify of all the other manufacturers and only collect one manufacturer. So that's where I've gone. And I think, you know, you grow to love that. I have, and I've grown to love Bryant and May stuff, whatever it is, within reason.
It initially started off as a boy's interest in simply picking something up because it looks nice. And before you know it, you've got 50 of them. I remember my parents, having read an article in the Daily Mail, paid for my first year's membership of the British Matchbox Label and Booklet Society, and that really pushed me forward a great deal to understand that there were other people that were interested in these things, to actually see something in a magazine that I had in my collection.
My personal opinion is, and I hope, you know, because you never know with these things, that the interest will still be there, but obviously with a smaller package of people within the world, because all the societies are getting smaller. And I think, you know, you will still have, because you've got historians for lots of different things, not only ephemera, you've got it for other things, you know, people cars and whatever, you know. So there's that history and the want, the people have got this thing in their mind, I need to do this. And it's us, you know, we do the same thing for little pieces of paper. People said I'm mad because I only collect one type. I'm even more mad because I collect them in matches. And do you realise that are a fire risk? Well, yes, I do, you know. But that is what I do, you know, because at the end of the day, if it wasn't there, a lot of this social history would disappear. Companies, you know, disappear. They go bankrupt or whatever. And all their history, it gets chucked in a skip.
Today there are far fewer collectors than there ever have been, which means with those collections that are being handed down to the next generation, there are in fact far more collections available than there ever were. So your chances of being able to build up a comprehensive collection are in fact far greater. This is something that anybody can collect. They are affordable. And depending on why you are collecting them, they can be exceedingly interesting.
Doreen Thomas was the John Walker side of it. She used to write articles for the Society about John Walker. Doreen was very, very focused, motivated, a woman who was lived and breathed John Walker. I think Doreen would be pleased. She would be loved to be here now, you know. I wish she was here. She was a wonderful person and a good friend.
It covers so many different subjects, you know, it's science, it's local history, it's how it changed people's lives, and it's everybody's lives. It's from, you know, the very sort of working classes to the very wealthy, you know, and how they showed off their wealth with it. So I think it's hugely important, and I think the story will continue beyond the 200 years anniversary.